Welcome back after the break. Any questions that came up during the break? Before the break, we talked about the basics of Program CS, Startup CS, and the basics of the controller stuff that we had here. And essentially what we are going to do is we are going to delete the generated weather forecast stuff. So please delete the weather controller and delete the weather forecast.cs class. We don't need it, just remove it. Now we have a nearly empty project. All this project does is it's setting up the dependency injection and the pipeline for us. So what we can now do is we can add our own controllers. But in this course, we are going to focus on building controllers which are backed by entity framework. So in the background, we would like to access a database. So therefore, we have to do all the necessary steps that we learned and practiced in the last few weeks in order to get a database context, modal classes, and so on and so on. Let's do exactly that. For that, I will create a folder in my project and I ask you to follow along. So right click on the project, add new folder, and I will call it data access. You can call it data, you can call it business logic, you can call it whatever. It's just a name. But data access is something that seems appropriate for this small, nice little application. It will just contain all the necessary modal classes that we have. I will add a new add class here and I will call it modal.cs. I will put all my modal classes here. I hope I don't have to describe what a data modal is in general because we had that in the last few weeks over and over again. It's just the classes that represent the database structure that we want to fill and read through Entity Framework. In our case, we decided to store video games. Let's create, just to make it a little bit more interesting, let's create a class which we call game genre. We will do a property of type integer. That's just a rhetorical question. Can you remember what ID is all about? You don't need to provide an answer. I hope that you already know the answer. It's for setting up the primary key, for setting up the auto-generated key. I'm sure you can remember that from the lessons in the last few weeks. If you can't remember what this ID is all about, then please recap what we did by watching the videos again or reading about Entity Framework primary keys. Let's add a second property, which is a string, and let's call it name, and do a max length property here. We discussed that. Maybe 150 characters seem fine, and we will do a required here. And let's assign an empty string here as the default value. That might be a very simple, basic data class. Let's add a second class. Let's make it also public. Don't forget that. Oops. And this class should be called game, because that will store a video game. Let's add the ID property again. We know it, primary key, blah, blah, blah. You can remember that. We can essentially copy the name property from up here, because the video game will have a name too. The game should be stored in or should belong to a certain genre. This is why we add the game genre reference here. This is the relationship. Can you remember? One-to-many relationship. One game belongs to exactly one genre. Genre could be sports game, shooter, something like this. And if we have the one side of the relationship, we also have to add the n side of the relationship. So we have to add to the game genre the list of game here, and let's call it games, so that we can easily query which games do we have in the genre sports games, for instance. Nice. And then just for demo purposes, let's add a personal rating. Maybe a star system, 5 stars for the best game, 0 stars for a game that really isn't good. I think you get the idea. Good. Let me zoom out a little bit. Yes, now we can discuss questions and you can write down the code. Question. Good. Let's add a new class, and this time it will be our video game data context. I hope you can remember how we build data contexts in Entity Framework. We have practiced that for many weeks now, and you have your cheat sheet. Just to make sure you can remember, in your cheat sheet that you have in GitHub, you have exactly that example where you have this data model, blah, and we didn't cover the on-model creating. We don't need that yet because we have rather simple solutions. So all we need to do is derive from DB context. I think there is a more appropriate one. Yes, this is what I was looking for. Sorry, I showed you the wrong one. This is exactly the right one, and now I'm in the correct chapter. I'm sorry. Create a DB context. This is exactly the DB context that we want to do. So you don't need to somehow, I don't know, remember that by heart. You can always take a look at the cheat sheet. So what do we have to do? First, select the proper data context base class. Oh my God, DB context base class is not available. What did I forget? Help me. Correctly, NuGet package. Right click on the project, manage NuGet packages, and look for Entity Framework. And I'm going to use SQL Server. Sorry, I had the wrong package source here. So Entity Framework, and then I take the SQL Server one because this is what I'm going to use. There is already a hotfix for 5.0. It's brand new. It's 2 days old. This is why I told you yesterday to make sure that you have the latest version of Visual Studio installed. The 5.0 version works too. Okay, good. Now we have that one. This is the DB context, and now we can add the using statement and we can continue with creating our database context. The next thing I'm going to copy from the cheat sheet because, well, I'm a lazy programmer. Lazy programmers are good programmers. And I just have to change the name of the context, and the DB set should be game and games. That's all. You see, in practice, for your homework, for the exam, take a look at the cheat sheet, copy the code, and just make the necessary changes. That makes you way more productive. Of course, in our case, we have 2 entities here. So it's not just game, but it's also game genre. And this is the genres. I am really not sure if the plural of genre is genres. Yes, it's correct like that. It's genres. Good. Any questions so far? This was just a repetition. When creating Entity Framework applications in the console, we had to add one very important additional NuGet package. Can anybody remember what the second NuGet package was beside the SQL Server stuff? Correct, Microsoft Entity Framework Core Design. Please add Microsoft Entity Framework Core Design. Nice. And I'm now seeing that that NuGet asks me to do some updates. Let's check which updates NuGet suggests. Okay, there is a small little minor update for 2 packages down here. I can select it and hit update. That's fine. If you want, it's not absolutely necessary, but hey, I want to really be up to date. So if you want, you can follow along and do the update. It's not necessary, but I'm feeling more clean if everything is up to date. I don't know why. Good. What did we have to do next when we built our console apps? we had to create the data context factory, and we had to add a NuGet package for configuration stuff and all these things. We don't have to do that with ASP.NET anymore. We are done. That's it. We can now use Entity Framework with ASP.NET Core. We just have to register it in a single line of code. I will show you that in a second. So using Entity Framework in Web API projects is really, really simple. A few very basic steps. Add the NuGet packages, add the modal classes, add the database context, and register the database context. These 4 steps, and you're done. So therefore, forget about the context factory. We don't need it. We directly go into Startup CS, because here I told you that there is a central location where we want to register all our helper classes that we use throughout our app, and this is exactly this configure services method. And guess what? The required code is part of your cheat sheet. See it? Configure services, this is exactly the method that we are talking about, and all you need to do is you need to copy this line. If you don't want to use SQL Server, you have to change this part of the code. So if you want to use Postgres or SQLite or any other database, just use a different use statement here. But for our purposes, we can simply copy this one, copy it, and put it here. Of course, it's not the blogging context, it's the video game data context. Oh, video game data context, and we need to add a using statement. It doesn't find use SQL Server, no problem, just add the using statement. It can't find configuration. Why? Here it's with an uppercase C, so we can just change it here to uppercase C, and it works. And now we have Entity Framework available in our Web API. Again, I repeat myself consciously, okay? The same steps that you had to go through in the last few weeks for your homeworks and so on apply here without the factory. The factory is no longer necessary. This just works. Finally, as the final step, it is somewhat obvious. We have to define the connection string here. Okay, so we have to go into our app settings, and again, I will use my cheat sheet. Hopefully, I do not need to describe that in any more details. I will just add the connection strings here. I just, to make sure that everybody really understands what I did here, I just copied the connection string here. And then you have to change the connection string according to your settings. For instance, the database name. It's not address book, of course. It's video games. The instance of the local DB. It's called a little bit differently by default. Can anybody remember how I find out what the name of the instance of SQL Server Local DB on my machine is? We discussed a small little helper program that we called for that. Exactly, and that will give me all the instances that run on my machine. I copy that here, and that's fine. Good. I am happy. Database context, check, done. Quick question, you should know that by now. What are the final 2 steps in order to create the database? It has nothing to do with ASP.NET. It's just a repetition of Entity Framework. What do I have to do? 2 things. Exactly. First, not run the migrations. First, we have to create the migrations, and then we have to run exactly .NET EF migrations add, I will call it initial. That's part of your cheat sheet. You don't need to know that by heart. Looks good. Oh, the system tells me that my entity framework tooling is a little bit older. I'm missing one patch here, but that's fine. I will update it later on. If you don't get an error, everything should be fine. And the second one, you said it, we have to apply the migrations. .NET EF database update. And that should run the necessary create table statements. And hopefully we don't get an error. Nice. I will just run my data studio just to make sure. LocalDB, and if we are lucky, and the demo gods are smiling, we will see, oh my god, video games, good. And we have games and genres, and we see that we have a foreign key here. Everything is fine. So I will now leave that one here, highlight this one and highlight this one, and wait for a second until everybody could catch up. Good, so let's continue now. Now we have the database context, and we want to have a controller which allows us to get some data and to write some data and so on and so on. Right click on controllers and just say add class. You have add class, right? Good. So just right click add class. That's fine. And then we will call it games controller or whatever name suits your needs. Games controller. What are the things that we need to add to a class in order to make it a controller? Let me show you again. I discussed it already, and you can, if you haven't deleted it, you can copy it from the weather controller. But it's very simple. Base class is controller base. Attribute is API controller. And second attribute is route, where we specify the route. In my case, I just say API games. So please do that. Add a class, games controller, or any other name that you like. Add the base class, controller base. Add the API controller attribute. And add the route attribute. I will wait for a second so that you can catch up. Next thing that we do is we add a constructor. I'm sure you know that. CTOR tab will give us a basic constructor. CTOR, like constructor, tab will give us a basic controller, basic constructor. And now we enter the world of dependency injection. If we want to have a data context available in our controller, all we need to do is, just like in Angular, use so-called constructor injection. So all we need to do is we need to say, please ASP.NET give me a video game data context. That's all we need to do. And then we can save this context in a field. If that was too fast, you can just use the light bulb here and say create and assign field context. That is dependency injection. Let me make that very clear. If I go to startup and put startup here on the side, because we did this here, because we said add DB context, ASP.NET Core knows how to inject, this is why it's called dependency injection, how to inject the data context in our ASP.NET controller. So this up here in the configure services method enables constructor injection, so we get the data context in the controller. Do you understand this connection between Startup CS and Games Controller? If not, let me know. I can go into more details. Let's start with two very simple operations. The first one is let's return all games. Return all games means we want to read games. Which HTTP verb are we going to use for that? Get, post, put, patch, or delete? Get. Get means get, read. HTTP get is the verb that we need for reading data. Okay? Now let's write a method. What should this method return? A list of all games. So, a list of all games. Or to make it a little bit better, IEnumerable of games. Any kind of list. Oh, sorry, game, not games. Game. IEnumerable is the base interface of all the different collections. IEnumerable is implemented by an array, by a list, and by many other collections. So IEnumerable is a very good return type if you want to return a collection of something. Get all games. Will this method be difficult to implement? Absolutely not. Return this dot context dot games. That's it. We're done. We will return all games here. It's as simple as that. And we can immediately try it. So if we run our application, and you can do that on your own, then you see API games. Let's give it a try. API games, and drum roll, yes, we get an empty array. You see that? Well, of course, because we didn't insert any games yet. But it works. It really accessed the database. We are done. We have the first proof of concept of adding a database-backed API, which we can now use in Angular, for instance. So I can simplify that a little bit. I don't need this. And for such short methods, I don't even need to use the long version. I can clarify that a little bit. I can just use the lambda syntax if you want. Yeah, so it's really a one-liner. That's all you need to do. Now let's add a method to add a game. I just told you, but let's check whether you remember it. Which verb should we use? Get, post, push, put, patch, or delete? For inserting a game, for adding a game. What's the best practice? Pardon? Nope. Correct. Post is the correct one for inserting data. Public. What does post return? Well, it inserted something. Well, best practice is to return the inserted item. So we will return game. The game that we just add. Add game. Game, new game. This is what we get. And this game here comes from body. This is the important one. From body in that area means that ASP.NET Core should read the data of the game that we want to add from the HTTP body. Now, how do we add data to Entity Framework? We have done that over and over and over again, so please remember it or look it up. If you can't remember it, you did it in the homework in the last few weeks over and over again. Context.add, new game, wait, context.save, changes async, return new game, because we just want to return the element that we just saved. Okay, we have a problem here. Oh, sorry, here. We have a problem. Await doesn't work. What do I have to change here? We did that in the last 2 weeks over and over again, so I hope you remember it up to now. Async task of game. And that's it. It's as simple as that. Take the object, add it to Entity Framework, call save changes, and we're done. And then let's give it a try. Let's run this guy. If we now take a look at the documentation, we now see that we have a get for the games and a post for the games. We want to try to insert a record into games. Let's use Postman for that. API/games, and we would like to add data here. So therefore, we have to specify something in the body, okay? Yeah. In the body, we can say that we would like to add in Postman, this is important, you see I'm here in body, I would like to add JSON. JSON is the important one, not JavaScript, JSON. I would like to add JSON to my request. And then we can add some JSON here. Somebody is unmuted. Can you please mute yourself? Now let's take a look at the game object. This is the game object. First, it contains an ID. Do we have to specify the ID when adding a game? Of course not, because that is the primary key that will be generated by the database. Do we have to specify a name? Yes, because it's required. So let's add a name. And here you can enter your favorite video game. I will say Summer Games. It's very old, it's a classic. I played it when I was a child. But yeah, add any kind of video game that you like. And with that, we could give it a try. Let's see what happens if we just hit send. The important things are, let's recap. Post, correct URL, go to body, change it to JSON, and then specify the content of the JSON just like that. Hit send. And see what we get back? We get back the inserted row, including the name and the ID that was assigned by Entity Framework inside of the database. And the default value for personal rating, I didn't specify it, is 0. So if I go here to my database, where is it? Here it is. And if I take a look at the content of the database, it's really inside the database. That's all we need to know. And now that we have added the games, we can simply add a second tab here, paste in the URL, and now use get. And with get, I now don't get an empty array, but I get my game that I just added back from the database. You can try it again. I will try it again with Winter Games, also a game that I played when I was a child. And this time I will use a personal rating of 5 stars because I love this game. Run it. It worked. Go back to the get, run it, and you should now get back 2 games. And if you check it in the database, it should just work. The next game that I would like to add, please take a look at me, at my screen. Then I give you a little bit of time to try it out on your own. I will add a game, Prince of Persia, also a very old game. I loved it when I was a child. And this time I will specify a genre. See that one? And this will be another embedded object. It will have a name, and that is a jump and run game. Let's try this one. And here we get a problem. Here we get a problem because the JSON serializer, JSON exception, tells us that it detected a cycle. This is a problem that you really often run into, and I would like to show it to you what the problem is. So this error was by design. I consciously enforced this error, but everything else should work. So before we continue, I will take some drink and I will wait until you could follow along and maybe add at least 1 record to the database, and maybe you also can generate this error. Okay, good. So now I would say before we fix our last cycle problem and add some additional methods and then create a small Angular application which consumes our web API, let's make another break because we just worked for more than an hour. So let's make 15 minutes break. Okay. So it's 10:25. So let's continue at 10:40. So 10:40.